I would like to acknowledge that we are on stolen land. This work was developed across several countries, lands and nations, from the ancestral place of Warrain across to the lands of the Wangal people and up to the Gumbaynggirr nation, and now as I speak to you from the lands of the Darug people. This work was also informed by the people of the Great Wiradjuri nation, my Pop's people, my ancestors. Art practice and process to heal, connect and understand was created on this continent by the oldest living culture in the world and is at least 60,000 years old. It did not originate in the United Kingdom, and it was not brought here by a colonizer, despite what textbooks say. It is embedded into the DNA of First Nations people. It is our law, our songlines, and our kinship, and it continues to be colonized, appropriated, and stolen. As such, Australia continues to have very few registered First Nations art therapists due to systemic and individual racism in education. There are also significant barriers to accessing art therapy as treatment, healing, and cultural practice for First Nations people, just as there are barriers to identification, assessment, and diagnosis of autism for First Nations people via colonized, racist, medicalized systems and culturally inappropriate assessments. These control and gatekeep accesses to support and self-understanding, and as a result, many autistic First Nations people remain excluded from both autism and art therapy research, or unable to receive a culturally appropriate experience of research. Although this is not the focus of the topic I am studying for many complex reasons, it remains important for me to acknowledge. I encourage every non-Indigenous researcher and practitioner in this space to do better. The work is yours to do, not ours. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my Masters of Science research program. The title is Defining Autistic-Led Art Therapy Practice Guidelines for Late Diagnosed Autistic People Assigned Female at Birth. It's really easy to pronounce. My name is Amalia Jewell. Everybody calls me Marley. And this is my graduate research confirmation progress review. So today, during this presentation, I will use specific terms. These are AFAB, or Assigned Female at Birth. This term creates an umbrella for all assigned and socialized as women and girls, including non-binary, gender diverse, and trans men. Typically, the acronym AFAB is not appropriate in community conversation. So typically people prefer assigned female at birth and for it to not be the acronym, but I will use the shorthand here due to time constraints. I'm also going to be using the term allistic. This term means non-autistic and is a community preferred term. It dismantles the supremacy in the more widely known term neurotypical. I'm also going to be using the words traditional and colonial interchangeably. This relates to the practices adopted after colonization by the British and is the dominant structure embedded in contemporary therapy models and pedagogy. I'll also be referring to AAC, or augmentative and alternative communication, and that is any method used to communicate other than spoken speech, such as written text, visual reference, or text to voice. And I'll also be talking about AT, assistive technology, which are devices, equipment, or softwares that support communication, learning, mobility, sensory regulation, or daily living, such as programs like Speechify and Read and Write. So a snapshot of my project. So when looking into my topic, I looked at the guidelines around Australia and internationally for art therapy practice. There are no autistic-led art therapy practice guidelines in Australia, and traditional colonial art therapy has largely been developed through white, Western, colonist, ableist, and holistic frameworks that shape assumptions about communication, behavior, emotional expression, and what constitutes successful therapy. So therapy is still predominantly positioning difference as deficit and something to be fixed. So this study will look at and explore how late diagnosed autistic people assigned female at birth experience art therapy. It focuses on understanding what makes art therapy feel safe, respectful, helpful, or harmful from the experiences of autistic people themselves. It centers autistic participants as experts in the processes and practices of art therapy designed to support them. So my literature review was broken up into sections, I guess. So I looked at current general autism research, which basically looked at, the existing autistic research samples and the fact that they're predominantly people assigned male at birth, those diagnosed in childhood or who are still children, mixed disability groups, or autistic adults with intellectual disability, with very limited representation of late diagnosed autistic AFAB people. There was also limited involvement of autistic researchers, and the findings were often interpreted by holistic researchers. Research methods may also be inaccessible or unsuitable for autistic participants. The key themes in the small selection of autism AFAB literature was that most literature in this subsection is focused on previous misdiagnosis, diagnostic processes, and the adaptions of diagnostic processes. So lots of good work being done about making sure that we get better diagnostic protocols and understandings, but that's kind of where its focus is. When it did look at autistic traits in this group, there was a lot of excessive masking, assimilation, and camouflage behaviors. And these were often linked to other behaviors like overcompliance and poor boundaries that people often use as lifelong survival behaviors. Post-diagnosis, there's a lot of conversation around disrupted identity development and also a lot of information about limited psychoeducation following late diagnoses, so lack of follow-up. There are high rates of misdiagnoses, mental illness, physical illness, and suicidality, and significant levels of anxiety, depression, burnout, and emotional dysregulation. So when looking at the gaps in existing research, I did a search. I started obviously focused on my topic, and I looked for peer-reviewed literature on art therapy or art psychotherapy involving autistic adult women, or AFAB where specified, without co-occurring intellectual disability, where art therapy was delivered as a professional therapeutic intervention. I identified absolutely no studies meeting this criteria. So the key critiques of the general therapy and autism research that I was able to look into is that autistic voices rarely define therapy practices, which are typically determined by holistic therapist researchers, who often prioritize assimilation and holistic goals over autistic needs. So the research rarely asks autistic people about experiences of distress, disconnection, or unsafety in therapy. Instead, they hyper-focus on the narratives of participant deficits or challenges from the therapist's point of view. Limited attention is given to sensory environments, therapist behaviors, cultural differences with holistic therapists, choice and control, and information processing demands. The existing literature is predominantly shaped by holistic researchers, therapists, and carer interpretations, rather than direct autistic lived experience, leaving autistic voices largely absent from defining good therapeutic practice. So looking at my focus, my research aim was critically evaluate traditional colonial art psychotherapy practices and identify what supports or undermines safety and therapeutic benefit for late diagnosed autistic AFAB adults. My main research question is what changes or adaptations to traditional colonial art therapy practices are important for creating a safe, respectful, and neuroaffirming art therapy environment for people assigned female at birth who are diagnosed with autism later in life. So my research goal is to create a guideline document for art therapists written using the experiences of autistic people, AFAB, who have experienced art therapy in Australia to support a safer and more supportive art therapy practice and spaces. So I have two participant groups. I have my primary group, which is my autistic participant sample. So they will complete all rounds of a Delphi study as well as review the guidelines. They are eligible for payment. The eligibility criteria, they must be over 18, so they must be an adult. They must have a formal diagnosis of autism, which means they must have been diagnosed formally by a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist or a neuropsychologist. And they must have been diagnosed in adulthood, so after the age of 18. They must have been assigned female at birth. That doesn't mean that they have to continually identify as female now, but just that they were assigned female at birth and were probably predominantly socialized as a girl. They must not have an intellectual disability, and they also must have previous experience with art therapy within Australia. The art therapist sample is very small and will only be relevant in the end. So they will complete the guideline review only. They are not eligible for payment. And the eligibility criteria is that they must be professionally registered as an art therapist with ANZA CARTA, which is our national peak body regulator. They also must have a formal autism diagnosis and experience working with autistic adults assigned female at birth. So the study design framework that I'm kind of using is informed by 3 different types of frameworks: neuroaffirming and autistic-led co-production. So this recognizes autistic participants as experts in their own experience, enabling them to shape the practice guidelines, whilst understanding autistic neurotypes as important and beneficial. Trauma-informed practice, which recognizes the traumatic impacts of masking, burnout, long-term invalidation, and other lived experiences. So it uses experience near language and adapts how sensitive experiences are explored and captured. And decolonization and dismantling holistic supremacy. So this critically examines assumptions embedded within dominant practice and research models. It questions who defines acceptable communication, sensory environments, art-making practices, session structures and goals, and whose interests those standards serve. The methodology that I will be using is a Delphi co-production framework. So this study uses a mixed method Delphi design to build autistic-led consensus across multiple rounds of online questionnaires. There are 3 rounds of questionnaires. Participants contribute anonymously. Responses are gradually refined into shared practice recommendations. The use of a Delphi study supports autistic participants as it reduces social pressure and expectations and avoids mirroring and assimilation behaviours. It allows private reflection, which reduces camouflage and masking behaviours, and it also enables self-paced participation, which supports processing differences and reduces cognitive burnout. So the study design adaptation has become a very big part of my research, much bigger than I have ever intended it to be. I started to look into research around study design adaptation because of my own lived experience as an autistic person who hates Likert scales and hates most clinical research tools and struggles to really be able to reflect my experience with them. And I found some amazing research that really has focused on this and that kind of validated a lot of my own experiences. So because there is research into the accessibility concerns within these standard research instruments, and especially things like Likert scaling, autistic researchers have summarized that additional time might be required to interpret questions and formulate responses in flexible participation formats may improve engagement and reduce perceived time pressure. Environmental distractions, including group-based discussions, can lead to masking, assimilation, and camouflage practices, as well as meltdown, shutdown, and burnout. Questions should also be direct and provide context and prompts. AAC and AT should be included alongside supportive materials. And they also summarize that autistic perspectives are marginalized by researcher bias and that data should be analyzed by autistic researchers where possible or protected from sole holistic interpretation. So they advocate highly, obviously, for autistic research to be done by autistic people, autistic researchers, or for autistic researchers to at least be involved in the study design and the analysis of the data, so that autistic perspectives kind of aren't put into, I guess, under a holistic lens. So in response to that research, I did a lot of adaptation to the design of the study and spent a long time writing the questions and trying to get the wording right and basically trying to build the best survey that I could. So I included things like further options for tick box responses, including boxes for unsure and something different. And when these boxes were clicked, a dynamic text box dropped down and allowed the person to write additional context and explanation in free text. So they could click unsure and then, you know, we'd say, please describe, and they would give us a little bit of context. Almost all of the questions use open-ended response fields instead of like typical Likert scaling. I only use that at the end. There is division into clear sections that address core experiences of both autistic adults and traditional art therapy practices, and contextual information surrounding questions, including example responses. I also included supportive psychoeducation materials such as emotional labeling resources, and I made sure there was a reduced reliance on rigid rating systems, and I used visual rating systems. There is a save and return functionality and online asynchronous participation. We also use branching logic to skip irrelevant sections to reduce cognitive burden so that people hopefully weren't having to sit and read through questions that they'd previously indicated were not relevant to them. And where possible, we tried to make everything accessible for assistive technology and AAC compatible infrastructure and audio recorded response options. So in that, the first thing that we kind of looked at when I was building the study was visual design guidelines. And I know this is not a typical thing that most researchers think of. I have an undergraduate degree in communicative co-design. So I was a graphic designer for a period of time. So I'm well aware of how we design for disability, and in my presentation, what you're actually seeing is how we design for disability. So you'll see some of the things in my own presentation that are part of the visual guidelines for designing for disability. So the use of sans serif fonts, for example, with heading text at 16 to 20 point and body text at 12 to 14 point, which for most people might be considered quite large. Strong text to background contrast and muted backgrounds. So white backgrounds are the worst thing for different brains to process. So putting a darker background is more beneficial. Text change and color blocking to convey structural and section change. And you can see that I'm using color blocking in my bullet points because they help my brain move quickly. consistent and predictable visual structure, so keeping the same structure in place, clear headings, subheadings, and visual hierarchy with adequate white space. Just an aside that white doesn't mean white, it means free, not the color white. No flashing elements or unnecessary animation, and no distracting visual effects or use of stock imagery. So stock imagery can really do really horrible things for people that have cognitive challenges. And so it's best if you don't use any imagery at all unless you have to. So looking at the study design structure of the actual study itself, round 1 was open-ended exploration, and this survey round has just closed. So this is where I'm currently at in my progress. I've just completed round 1, and I'm about to analyse the responses from this. So round 1, the sections were split into unique processes of the art therapy environment and autistic processing to enable contextual background information about the nature of the question. So participants completed an open-ended questionnaire relating to these 8 sections. So the sections were divided so that it would be a natural stopping point for people to perhaps take a break or use the save and return function. It also helped to categorize certain things so that people's brains were able to understand what these questions specifically related to. So there were things like obviously demographic information, the participant use of art therapy, why they are engaging in art therapy, the aspects of traditional colonial art therapy that may be unhelpful. So those are pretty much kind of the things that we are taught in uni and the things that we kind of do as standard. Sensory and emotional experiences in art therapy spaces, the experiences of art materials in art therapy, and the experiences of traditional therapist behaviors in art therapy. So those, once again, will be those kind of things that therapists are taught across the board about how we interact with people in therapy. And experiences of working with autistic art psychotherapists. This was an optional section, so it included branching logic where the person identified if their art therapist had openly disclosed that they were autistic, and if they hadn't, then the survey ended there, so there was no need for them to go through those questions. The estimated time of completion was about 75 to 90 minutes to factor in autistic process. At the moment, looking at the data, the median process was probably around 35 to 40 minutes. So people were doing it a lot quicker, which was good. So looking at the structure, like I was saying before, at the beginning of each section of round 1, contextual information was provided, along with links to emotional labeling resources and further mental health support. So this is an example of the contextual information preceding the sensory section. So participants saw this information and it was delivered to them on one screen. So they couldn't see any of the questions. They kind of read through it and then they clicked I understand, and then they went into the actual questions. So an example is, so what I've said in this example is, this section relates to things you might have experienced in art therapy that affected your sensory system. Humans have 8 different senses: vision, sound, tactile, gustation, olfactory, vestibular, emotion, interoception. Autistic people tend to have higher engagement and challenges with all 8 resources, eight senses. So this was important because a lot of people do not know that we have 8 senses. And so they might not know that they might have challenges in one area because they don't even recognize that it's there. So that was important to kind of also provide a little bit of psychoeducation about the 8 sensory systems, especially things like interoception, which, many holistic people probably won't even know about because that system is functioning at a level that means that they don't have challenges. So they don't have to worry about not getting hunger signals or not knowing when they need to go to the bathroom and things like that. These questions are based on the way that most art therapists set up spaces and use the sensory system. Your art therapist might not do all of these things or any of them. In this section, try and think about things that may have engaged your sensory system. This might be both positive and negative sensory experiences. This might be upsetting to remember, so take your time and have breaks if you need it. If you are very upset, you can contact the numbers for support here, and there was a link to the National Helpline Services. This section might ask you questions about how you feel. Some examples of emotions are understood, misunderstood, engaged, isolated, comfortable, uncomfortable, relaxed, stressed. If you need some support to find the right emotions, you can use these resources. And then there was a link to emotional labeling resources. Those emotional labeling resources looked like this. So this is an example. So there's a document that takes them into another window, and there are about 12 of these emotion wheels, and there are about 40 of these weather signals. The weather signals was developed in another research program that I did when I was working somewhere else, and they were also developed for people with alexithymia. So we developed a visual aid to help them identify emotions. This was provided at every single section, by the way. So each question in round one also contained contextual information and examples of what answers might look like to support processing and address anxiety around expectations. So this is an example of contextual information supporting the survey questions. So we asked the question, how do therapist behaviours during art therapy sessions affect your well-being and sense of safety, if at all? And then in the green, you can see where we provided some context around what they might say. This might include when the therapist speaks, where they sit, what they say, if they write notes or make art alongside you in the space. This may be positive, such as feeling seen, supported, validated, or assisted in understanding your artwork, or experienced as negative, such as feeling watched, judged, or misunderstood. Please describe your experiences in your own words. Another example was, what are the sounds typically like in your art therapy space? How do sounds in the art therapy environment affect your experience? And the contextual information is, this may include intentional sounds such as music or the therapist's voice, and unexpected or environmental sounds such as traffic, voices, or building noise. So please describe your experiences in your own words. We did this because a lot of autistic people might have challenges recalling. The question might be too vague, and they might not be able to kind of bring forth some of those experiences. So giving them some prompts, as in what they could have experienced, helps. And, the system was also designed to reject anybody who was just copying and pasting an answer. So they weren't able to just kind of copy the contextual text and dump it in there. That would be flagged immediately. Round two looks at exploring themes. So this survey round is due to begin in late July, August. So responses from round one are synthesized into key themes. But unlike traditional Delphi studies, participants are again able to expand on their experiences through open-ended questions. So an example of the thematic question, and these are just predictive because obviously I don't have this data yet, so keep that in mind. Theme one, reasons for art therapy engagement. Many people shared that they use art therapy to understand their internal experiences better, explore their identity, and help communicate their thoughts, challenges, and needs with others. What is the main reason you find art therapy helpful? And then instead of being asked to rate using a Likert scale, participants at this point are asked for emotions around this experience to support us to analyze the impacts. So then they're asked, what emotions or feelings come up for you when you are creating something that helps you understand yourself during art therapy? The reason I wanted to go with that is that I feel that a lot of people within my specific population group tend to be big feelers, and we feel a lot. And we might not be able to tell you what happened, but we might be able to tell you how we felt about what happened. And I think even though we might not have the best words, we can always kind of feel when something feels unsafe, or when something felt good, or when something felt scary. And so putting in this option, I wanted to see whether or not this would help me kind of look at the level of impact that this specific theme was having on people. Round 3 will be the consensus rating. So this is when we'll kind of get into the more traditional Delphi study rating system, and they will rate statements to establish consensus around practice recommendations. But unlike traditional Delphi studies, the rating system is adapted to an emotion-based, text-based option or a visual scale, and they can select not applicable where a statement does not reflect their experience. An example is below, where the statement is, art therapists should not closely watch me without consent while I make art. I should have the option of privacy. And instead of asking them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, I again wanted to see what will happen if I ask them how much they connect to a statement. Autistic people within this group tends to use a lot of language around disconnection. And so I think there's a lot of lived experience around connection and disconnection, which is why I picked that word. So that's kind of the way that we'll measure the consensus rating. The final round will be the guideline feedback. So following round 3, the draft practice guidelines are developed from the Delphi findings. Feedback on the draft guidelines is invited from autistic participants who completed the study, as well as the autistic art therapist group. So this is where they'll come in, and like I said, these are the criteria for them. So feedback can be provided in written or audio format, and open text responses are welcomed. The draft guidelines are then refined following feedback before finalization. My project budget is here. This is what it looks like. Participants receive reimbursement for each Delphi round. So the first round is $30 because it's very, very long. Round 2 is $15, and then round 3 is $15 as well, and the maximum reimbursement is $60. I technically have enough budget for 60 participants to go through the entire process. Participants don't need to complete all rounds to receive the reimbursement, and they can withdraw at any stage. Like I said, we're not paying anybody for the draft guideline review. This study has received ethics approval from La Trobe, and they've received a plain language statement, consent form, participation is voluntary, consent's reconfirmed at the beginning of each Delphi round. People can withdraw during data collection without penalty. The participation is anonymous, so however, once the responses are submitted, individual data cannot be removed because I can't identify it. Responses are collected through Question Pro and stored at La Trobe. Study responses are stored separately from contact information, so email addresses were collected separately and only used for reimbursement and study updates. And findings are reported in aggregated form, and participants are not identifiable in publications, presentations, or guideline documents. The study limitations. So the study shares several methodological limitations with previous Delphi studies conducted with autistic participants. These are that Delphi studies prioritize consensus and may not capture all individual perspectives, and that may be more significant given the wide spectrum of autistic lived experience. Definitely our recruitment may not capture the full diversity of participants, and that's because differences in access capacity and the recruitment pathways. Demographic data was collected regarding location, diagnostic functioning level, and co-occurring identities like being chronically ill or First Nations, for example, to examine where gaps might have been occurred. Participant attrition between rounds may influence later stages of the study, and findings are also based on self-report experiences and perceptions and may be influenced by other life experiences such as adverse childhood experience that we don't focus on. There have been some implementation barriers, so all of that wonderful accessible design stuff that I talked about in terms of the visual accessible design, Question Pro has some limitations around that. So none of the visual design implementation could go ahead. It was put in and then I had to turn it off because it was interfering with people's assistive technology and AAC. Some of the platform functions like save and return They didn't operate consistently across participants and devices. The automated quality control and fraud detection systems incorrectly flagged legitimate participant responses, particularly where participants were using assistive technologies. So it flagged them as being fraud and they weren't. But unfortunately, there were fraudulent responses, scam participants, and AI-generated submissions, which I guess may affect the data quality and integrity, and they definitely required additional screening and verification processes. So we went through a process to screen them out once that was done. It did mean that I had to reissue the survey link with a password protected feature once I'd recognized that there had been fraud. And so that required people to have direct contact with me to request the survey and get the password protected link, which definitely increased the burden on participants for access. They couldn't just click the link that had been advertised anymore. So some expected findings and outcome were there. I need to have consideration of practice variation because art therapy is not a regulated profession in Australia. So training varies across institutions, and this results in lots of differences in the way that people approach it and the levels of professionalism and practice. So practitioner qualifications are also not always transparent for clients, meaning that data might be captured that does not relate to master's qualified practitioners or trained art therapists at all. And art therapy also does not have a standardized practice model or modality. So differences in settings like private practice, hospitals, community services, and delivery formats such as individual, group, and structured therapy programs may influence participant experiences. But I did collect data on where people accessed art therapy and how they accessed it. So that data does exist. Participants also might have contact with numerous art therapists within different contexts due to practitioners' personal practicing choices. This might result in conflicting lived experiences when answering space-specific questions. So it actually is relatively common for people to have an individual art therapist who doesn't run groups and then go to an art therapy group because that practitioner only runs groups. So they might be having contact with multiple therapists, which might confuse some of their responses. But my expecting findings and outcomes is that I'm expecting for them to identify specific practices that influence their safety, trust, comfort, engagement, and their sensory regulation, as well as identify both helpful and unhelpful aspects of traditional colonial art therapy practice. Some of the expected areas are practices and behaviours that are experienced as overly holistic and therefore unhelpful, differences in pacing and session structure, a need for reduced pressure for verbal explanation, an increase for therapists to be more sensory aware and collaborative to individual needs, adjustments within traditional art therapist relational behaviours, greater autonomy and choice around materials, session directions and goals, and more direct communication and boundary information. So the project outcomes, like I've discussed, is a clinical practice guideline, so an autistic-led consensus guideline document, and the guidelines are intended for art therapists working with autistic adults assigned female at birth in clinical practice and program development. I hope that the project may shift us away from assimilation-focused ideas of therapy and towards more respectful and neuroaffirming practice. The findings will be disseminated through 3 academic journals, articles. The first article, which I'm currently writing, focuses on the study design, adaptation, and the development of an autistic-led Delphi study structure and format, since that's become such a big part of this research. And subsequent articles will focus on participant findings and then the final practice guidelines. So the conclusion is that the development of autistic-led practice guidelines represents an act of decolonizing art therapy by challenging dominant systems in place. In this instance, by prioritizing autistic ways of knowing, communicating, and experiencing the world. This matters because autistic people assigned female at birth remain largely absent from research informing art therapy practice. Traditional colonial art therapy models have predominantly been developed through holistic assumptions, perspective, and systems of knowledge. And art therapists have historically defined the parameters, processes, expectations, and rules of clinical practice. So this project aims to reduce that power imbalance by positioning autistic people as knowledge holders rather than recipients of professional knowledge. This project centres autistic lived experience as a legitimate source of clinical knowledge, and the project aims to support more accessible art therapy practice. This is my reference list, which I'm sure you can see. And as a conclusion, I would just like to thank my two supervisors, Dr. Teresa Van Lith and Dr. Claire Brown, for their ongoing support of me and this project, and definitely for all of their expertise and insight, and being willing to learn about the other person's expertise and insight. It's been a very interesting thing to bridge these two things together, but they've both been really amazing and supportive, and have talked me down off a couple of ledges. So thank you for witnessing my meltdowns. And that is it. Thank you very much.